Good afternoon. My name is Robert Bland. I'm the associate editor for the Journal of Civil War Era, and I oversee the blog Muster. Today is the first in a series of conversations on new books in Civil War era history. And I have the genuine joy to introduce Justine Hill Edwards. Justine Hill Edwards is an associate professor of United States history at the University of Virginia. Her research explores the intersection of African American history, American economic history, and the history of slavery. Her first book, Unfree Markets, The Slave's Economy and the Rise of Capitalism in South Carolina, examined the economic lives of enslaved people, not as property or bonded laborers, but as active participants in their local economies. Based on her prize-winning dissertation, by examining an array of archival records from slaveholder accounts to legislative petitions, Unfree Markets shows that even though enslaved people increasingly participated in a capitalist economy, economic participation alone cannot secure what bondspeople wanted the most: freedom. Her most recent book, and the subject of today's discussion, Savings and Trust, The Rise and Betrayal of Freedman's Bank, chronicles the rise and fall of the Freedman Saving and Trust Company. Savings and Trust exposes how failure of the Freedman's Bank has shaped economic equality in America. Dr. Edwards' work has been supported by the Carnegie Corporation, the McNeil Center for Early American Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University, and the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Virginia. Dr. Edwards, I would like to begin by hearing you talk a little about the origins of this project. When did you know that you had the idea for Savings and Trust? And when did you know that this was actually a book that you needed to write and that there was a full story here?
Sure. First, thank you so much for having me. I read the journal every time it comes out, and so this is a real pleasure. So thank you. Well, I first started to think about this book in around 2015, 2016. I was finishing my dissertation, and I was thinking about, being on the job market and next projects. And at the time, I lived in DC, and my now husband would kind of walk around the White House complex. And one day he asked me about the Freedmen's Bank, and it was kind of random. I said, what do you mean? And he said, well, there's a plaque there now. It was erected in 2015 to commemorate the bank. And I said, oh, it was a bank founded during Reconstruction. And that was about it. And so once I started thinking through kind of what a second project could be, and thinking about the secondary literature on the Freedmen's Bank, and realizing that there were really good book chapters and really interesting analyses of the Freedmen's Bank in terms of the history of risk, for example. The last manuscript, the last book on the Freedmen's Bank, was published in 1976. And before that, the first book published on the Freedmen's Bank was published in 1927. And so it had been a while since any historian had really thought about a manuscript length treatment of the Freedmen's Bank. And I thought, well, this might be a really interesting way to connect what I did and the work that I was doing in my first book on the slaves economy in South Carolina to conversations that kept popping up within public political discourse about reparations and the racial wealth gap. And so I thought that there was a really interesting project there, and using the Freedmen's Bank to think about all of these topics again: the racial and economic inequality, the racial wealth gap, financial inclusion, and the participation of African Americans in finance, especially during the period of Reconstruction, would be a really fascinating second project and a really interesting way to think about all of these topics that I think, again, kept popping up in the public sphere and public political discourse.
That's fascinating. And right, there's clearly a story that had not been told that is kind of finally kind of being unearthed here. I'd be interested in you talk a little bit about the title of the book, right? Those two keywords, savings and trust. How do you kind of view kind of those working in tandem, and in what ways does the history of the Civil War era change if we kind of think about some of these questions of the bank, maybe the broader era, through this language of savings and trust?
Sure. Well, I think, well, I can't take total credit for it. I got to be honest. My editor and my publisher's marketing team, I think, did a really good job of us kind of brainstorming a title that would be provocative, but would still be a reflection of the work that I was doing in the book. But I do think that savings and trusts captures perfectly some of the analysis that I do in the book, the idea that African Americans were really investing in the Freedmen's Bank, and they were investing their life savings in this institution, hoping that their participation in their investments as depositors would help them make the transition from slavery to freedom, and importantly, help them buy land. And then that coupled with the idea of trust was so important, both in this period for African Americans, but if I take a step back too, thinking about what is important in supporting the financial system writ large, right? Trust that the financial institutions in which we place our money will be responsible stewards of our savings, of what we work so hard for financially. And so if we think about the idea of trust really being at the foundation, not just of the Freedmen's Bank, but of, again, our engagement with financial institutions, and then think about that in terms of the bank's main customers who were recently emancipated from slavery. I think the title perfectly captures the ideas that I discuss in the book about the relationship between savings and trust, especially for African Americans during Reconstruction.
Awesome. So I want to pivot back to that question of trust in a little bit, but to that question of savings, right? Before there was the Freedmen's Bank, there was the South Carolina Freedmen Savings Bank, right? You kind of do a good job of grounding the kind of history of the bank in the kind of Civil War era, right? The kind of the specific contingencies of the Civil War. And I can wonder if you could say a little bit about in what ways does the kind of rise of this savings bank and kind of maybe the long origin of the Freedmen's Bank broadly kind of connect to questions of emancipation, the military experience, and you kind of draw on the kind of experience around Sherman's Field Order 15, right? This kind of quest for land.
Sure. Well, the Freedmen's Bank was the brainchild of a white abolitionist minister named John Alvord. And in 1864, he was traveling around the South with the Union Army, and he took the opportunity to really speak to the freed people that he was meeting. And he also got to kind of witness the success of the three military savings banks established for Black soldiers in Norfolk, in Beaufort, and in New Orleans. And so these three military savings banks were essentially test cases to see how African Americans would engage with these financial institutions, and they were wildly successful. The New Orleans Savings Bank, for example, in the first year had received, I think, almost $65,000 in deposits from Black soldiers. And we're talking about a period of time, too, when Black soldiers were getting paid on par with their white counterparts for their military service. And one of their challenges was the fact that they didn't have a safe place to store their money, or they didn't have a way to save money for their families back home. And so these military savings banks were kind of a reflection of the interest of Black soldiers in patronizing a savings bank to kind of help them, again, make this transition from slavery to freedom with as firm a financial foundation as possible. And so interestingly, we can't really understand the creation of the Freedmen's Bank without understanding the success of these three military savings banks, and with Special Field Order number 15, in which African Americans were essentially given, again, plots of land on the Eastern Seaboard. And so these two events put together created, I think, a perfect opportunity for white philanthropists to say, okay, we can kind of put our good ideas to work to help African Americans financially. And so the creation of the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company was their tool to essentially help African Americans financially make that transition during the end of the Civil War into the beginning of Reconstruction.
Yeah, and to that point, right, kind of talking about the founding of the Freedmen Savings and Trust Company, I mean, how would you describe the kind of atmosphere, the kind of general spirit around the founding of the bank? In what ways does it capture what we might call the era of Jubilee, kind of this promise around emancipation. In what ways does this help us kind of see maybe some of the broader themes and kind of emancipation and Reconstruction era African-American history?
Sure. Well, I think it is interesting, right? The Freedmen's Bank was successful quickly, but its first few months started out slowly. And so I talk about this. I believe it's in chapter 2 or 3. I think it's in chapter 2, where I talk about the bank's administrators, the bank's vice president, and a few of the bank's trustees traveling to Virginia, specifically to Richmond, to try to convince African Americans in Richmond to open bank accounts once the bank opened in the city, which happened in October of 1865. And so they go to this Black church in Richmond, and they are trying to convince African Americans that, like, yes, this is a safe institution. You can put your money here, you can withdraw it when you need to, and this is the safest way for you to start to build wealth. And so there's kind of a back and forth, and a few of the Black men in this church congregation asked some really good questions. One, were there any Confederates on the bank's board of trustees? And the bank's vice president says, no, we are all Republicans and we support your claims to freedom. Another man asks, how is the bank guaranteed? Meaning, what is the relationship between the Freedmen's Bank and the federal government? Now, this is where the conversation kind of goes off the rails, I like to think, because the bank's vice president at this time says that the bank has essentially the full faith and credit of the federal government, which was not true. The Freedmen's Bank was a private financial institution given a charter by Congress, but it was essentially in private hands. But because it was established as just a benevolent institution, a simple savings bank, the idea that the bank would have oversight was kind of where the conversation got murky. But in many ways, the Freedmen's Bank was a representation of the kind of Republican vision of how African Americans would begin to live as free people, to buy land, to participate politically as much as they could. And the Freedmen's Bank was supposed to represent that, the kind of benefits of freedom coupled with the bank's investments and African Americans' investments in capitalism.
Right. Really embodying maybe the kind of highest frequency form of free labor ideology in many ways.
Exactly.
It'd be interesting to hear you say a little bit about the expansion of the bank. And this is something you write on page 44. Despite the bank's modest purpose, its mission was revolutionary. With the central branch in one city and given permission to open branches throughout the nation, the Freedmen's Bank was at the vanguard of branch banking in the 19th century. What do you mean when you say it's at the vanguard of branch banking?
Yes. And so one of the fascinating aspects of the history of the Freedmen's Bank, it was one of the first banks created under a new regulatory infrastructure. So the National Banking Act, which created the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency in 1863, meant that banks that wanted to operate nationally had to go through certain hoops, right? Jump over certain hurdles. And so the Freedmen's Bank was one of the first banks under this new infrastructure that had a central banking office in one city, but could have branches, satellite branches in others. And so at its height, the Freedmen's Bank had 37 branches in 17 states. And by branch, it was the largest bank in the nation, which is, again, kind of revolutionary, right? The largest bank in this period was a bank for recently emancipated African Americans. And so it was this structure of the bank, right? Having a central branch first in New York and then in DC, but having branches as far west as Houston, as far south as Gainesville, as far north as New York, meant that the Freedmen's Bank was actually kind of revolutionary for this period of time and how it operated.
And so you've done like a fantastic job of framing kind of the structure here, right? Thinking about the kind of regulatory structure, thinking about this as it kind of works as the state, kind of thinking about how we might see the state in the 19th century. But I'm also interested in the social history of the bank and how might we kind of understand how local communities encountered their branches, right? You have a number of really interesting anecdotes about Robert Smalls and how he encounters this bank in Beaufort. But what did kind of communities and freed people how did they encounter their local branch of the Freedmen's Bank?
Sure. Well, so each branch was essentially independently managed. Each branch had a cashier who we might consider kind of a branch manager, and that person would be responsible for managing deposits, for managing when a depositor wanted to withdraw, for signing up new depositors. And so each branch was kind of run semi-autonomously in that way. And so thinking about how these branches functioned, I think, is a great way to understand how African Americans actually interacted with these financial institutions. And so I start chapter 3 talking about a woman. Her name is Ellen Baptiste Lubin, and she is a depositor of the New Orleans branch. And her depositor records, I think, gives us just a fascinating glimpse into what perhaps the average depositor looked like in terms of their profile. She listed free as her status, which we can deduce a whole host of information from that. She may have claimed free because in 1866, when she opened her account, she was free. She may have been enslaved during the war prior, but we really don't know. She was a mother of 2. She was married, but her account was in her own name. And her husband's name isn't even on the depositor record, which I found just fascinating. But she reflects, for me, an important contingent of depositors, and that was Black women actually really taking a proactive step to ensure their financial futures as much as possible. And so she interacted with a branch cashier. At the beginning, most of the branch cashiers were white. They were moderately trained, but they weren't necessarily bankers. And by the 1872, about a third of the branch cashiers were Black. And so again, it is interesting to kind of look at this from the branch level because it gives us a sense of how successful some of these branches were in terms of encouraging depositors in the community to keep putting money in their accounts, but also kind of gives us a sense of just the sheer scope of the types of depositors who were really putting their money and their faith and their trust in this institution.
Right. No, I mean, that kind of really connects to the story of trust and having this faith and trust in these institutions. And as you set up beautifully and maybe a little tragically, right, this is also a story of betrayal.
Yes.
In what ways is this a story that captures what Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor calls predatory inclusion, right? In what way is this kind of desire to save, this emphasis on saving, entering freedom responsibly, exercising these responsible practices, dashed by the kind of practices that are happening as the bank shifts from savings and then illegally at first to kind of lending and kind of changing the charter and kind of unbeknownst to those who were saving at the local level, this was becoming a different type of institution and a less trustworthy institution.
Yes, exactly. And I love the fact that you bring up the term predatory inclusion because it's one of those terms that I kept thinking about as I was writing. Like, this is predatory inclusion a century before predatory inclusion is more palpable. But the bank quickly starts to make loans. It makes its first illegal loan in April of 1867. And so fairly quickly, just 2 years after the bank receives its charter. And the first illegal loan goes to the bank's actuary, a white man named D.L. Eaton. And he quickly pays back the loan, but I contend that it kind of sets the bank on a different course. And so by 1870, after lobbying members of Congress, especially because of the work of investment banker Henry Cooke, the brother of investment banker Jay Cooke, members of Congress decide to agree to amend the bank's charter. And so at first, the Freedmen's Bank is given a charter to operate as a simple savings bank. It is supposed to receive deposits of depositors, and it's supposed to give a small amount of interest on deposits. It's not supposed to make loans, and it's supposed to operate with the least amount of risk possible. And so when the bank gets the official go-ahead from Congress in May of 1870 to make loans, what happens is that the bank's board of trustees, especially the bank's finance committee run and controlled by Henry Cooke, begin to make hundreds of thousands, soon to be almost $3.5 million in loans in the first 2 years between 1870 and 1872. And most of those loans went to the business partners, friends of the bank's white trustees. One of the biggest loans we kind of learn after the fact actually goes to Henry Cooke. At first, people would believe that the loan is about $50,000, but it comes out later on after the bank fails that he borrowed about $500,000 from the bank. And so we are talking about 95% of the loan volume going to whites in and around DC, with about 5% of the loan volume going to African-American churches. But considering the fact that about 90% of the bank's depositors were Black, with about 10% being white, there was a dramatic asymmetry here of who could actually tap into and access the bank's money for loans. And most of those loans, again, went to whites who had personal and professional relationships with the Board of Trustees.
How does this happen? I mean, where is the Republican Party here? Someone should have gone to jail.
The question. That is the question. Well, a couple things. One, there is just loose regulation. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency is at this point trying to kind of figure out how to pay down the massive debt accrued by the Union during this Civil War. And the first examination does not happen until 1872. So the bank operates for 7 years without a formal or official examination. Again, this is about kind of cronyism. One of the fascinating parts of this that I was constantly surprised by is kind of finding names of people that I had read about, right? And so in finding out that like there were certain members of the board who owned companies who were then getting contracts from other members of the board. There were members of the board who served on like the board of public works of DC who was being loaned money from the bank from like a particular person on the board of trustees. And so we are talking about a fairly tight network of people. And there was just lax oversight.
And then enters Frederick Douglass, right? And kind of there's
yes.
a kind of the smell of corruption. There's a kind of people are needed to be removed from the bank. How does Frederick Douglass enter the bank's leadership? Kind of what is his kind of role here? And how does this fit into this larger story of Black Reconstruction, this rise of a kind of new Black elite in DC, right? In what ways do those networks kind of are important to kind of revitalizing trust in the bank?
Sure. So at this point, if we're talking about 1873, 74, as many of us know, the Panic of 1873 starts in September of that year. And of course, the first bank to fall was none other than Jay Cooke and Company, who was a debtor to the bank. This bank fails. At this point, John Alvord, who was the bank's founder, is the bank's president, and he had been president since 1868. And the Board of Trustees quickly begin to lose faith that he has properly stewarded the bank in the right direction. There are runs on the bank in the fall of 1873 such that African Americans become really afraid that they won't be able to access money in their accounts. And so at the beginning of 1874, a small group of Black trustees, there were three at this time, they kind of get together and they decide to try to convince members of the Board of Trustees to get rid of Alvord as president. He essentially steps down in March of 1874, and the trustees decide to kind of tap someone that they hope will kind of shore up African American trust and faith in the institution. Douglass, by this point, is living in DC. His sons are there too. He opens a Freedman's Bank account in 1871. He runs a Black newspaper in DC, and for the entire time that he runs this newspaper in the city, he runs ads and positive press for the Freedman's Bank. He's constantly asked to join the board, and he kind of demurs and says, yeah, sure, but not really. And so finally, in the spring of 1874, he says yes, because he recognizes that perhaps the bank needs him. And he had been kind of toying with the idea of making a move into politics. And so he joins the bank in March of 1874. He calls for a meeting in April of 1874 and realizes that the bank is insolvent. They have millions of dollars outstanding in loans. The majority of those loans had reached maturity, which meant that borrowers were just borrowing money and not paying it back. And he realizes that the bank is in dire straits. He appeals to African Americans. He writes these two circulars and says, the bank is fine. We, as African Americans, can kind of make sure that our trust and faith in this institution will help it survive the tumultuousness of the past several months. But African Americans are not assured. Congress finally steps in June of that year and mandates that the bank start to liquidate its assets. And in early July of 1874, Douglass really couldn't do anything to save the bank, and the bank fails while he is still kind of maintaining his short tenure as the bank's president.
Right. In fact, kind of makes the $10,000 loan to the bank that none of the other kind of board members seem to be willing to put the same level of investment, right? There's that
yes. At that same April 1874 meeting, he's there and all the trustees are around a table, and John Alvord actually turns to Douglass and says that the bank is in need of $10,000. I know that you have a $10,000 bond. Would you put this up to save the bank? And I write in the book, it is astounding that in a room filled with men, none of whom had been enslaved, only a handful of whom were Black, he, the only former slave, is asked to put up 10 grand of his own money to save the bank. And this is just a reflection of the really dire straits that the bank was in at this time, and just kind of how strange of a situation this was, that they would ask him to save the bank.
Right. No, there's a real tragedy here, right? And kind of capturing in many ways, right, the kind of the sweep of Reconstruction. I'll close by asking, what's the legacy of the bank's collapse? How did Black communities confront the legacy of the Freedman's Bank during the late 19th and early 20th century? What do you want readers to take away from the legacy of the bank?
Sure. Well, I think one of the, if I could encourage historians who are really interested in this bank to really kind of take up the charge of, is to look at the National Archives and just look at thousands of letters from African Americans into the 1920s and 1930s, and they are begging senators, congressmen, attorneys generals, even U.S. presidents. I mean, I talk at the end about a woman who appeals to President Roosevelt in 1937, kind of pleading with him, asking him to kind of help her recoup the money in one of her descendants' accounts. And nothing comes of it. And so what I say at the end of the book is that we continue again to have conversations about wealth inequality and the racial wealth gap. And there is a long legacy of distrust of traditional white financial institutions. And that does not come from nowhere, right? If we look at the history of the Freedmen's Bank, if we look at the loss of trust that African Americans have had of white-owned, white-run financial institutions, we see that this is kind of where it starts. And it's, I think, important to recognize that this happens in the first period of slavery after the end of the Civil War, and that's important to remember. And so these memories, I think, are kind of encoded in our DNA for understanding why trust continues to be a problem, why the racial wealth gap is so related to how African Americans have kind of mistrusted these institutions. And there are recent studies from the FDIC, for example, from the Department of Treasury is another one that has stated that African Americans are least likely than white Americans to have a relationship with a financial institution. I think the most recent data suggests that about 14% of African Americans are unbanked, which means that they don't have a long-term relationship with the financial institution, not having a checking or savings account. That number is 2.1% amongst white Americans. And we also know that to build wealth, especially for kind of working class and middle class Americans, having a sustained credit building relationship with the financial institution is fundamentally important. And so why is that the case, right? It's not that African Americans don't have the money or the capital. It's from these kind of generational legacies of mistrust. And these memories don't just disappear. Again, they're kind of embedded in these relationships. And so I think that is one of the major takeaways, is to understand why this history continues to be so important.
Well, Dr. Hill Edwards, I want to thank you again for taking the time to talk to the Journal about your important work. I encourage all of our listeners, all of our readers to go out and purchase this book. It's a kind of valuable kind of account for this specific moment in history, and also more specifically thinking about the Civil War era through the language of cessation and trust. Thank you again for taking the time out this afternoon. Look forward to hearing more about your book in the months to come.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Thank you.